Good evening, everyone, and I hope this new year. Good evening, everyone. Hope this new year has begun well for you. And if you've already logged in, please take time for a quick fun poll. Can we have the poll up, please? Thank you. Great. Well, nobody's hitting the gym for sure. And I guess we have travel plans and some still want to stay at home. Okay. For me, I want to travel. I just want to get out of my house. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your responses. I'd like to welcome everybody here, and it's my privilege to welcome you as a coordinator of GENSA, the Gender and Equity Network South Asia, a special interest group of the Community of Evaluators South Asia. That includes Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Today, we are hosting our first event of the new year in 2021, a masterclass by Donna Podems in cooperation with Eval Gender Plus. And we are indeed very privileged to have an introduction by the global evaluator and thinker, Michael Quinn Patton. Our dedicated team of young evaluators who are our volunteers have been working really hard behind the scenes to provide this quality and very thought-provoking content for our membership. And so we also welcome others who have joined us from all over the world. We have over 400 registered, and we are also streaming live on Facebook. You must have all got the link to that as well. So the GENSA volunteers are going to take us through today's session. And so may I invite Neha to take over.
Thank you, Sonal. We are indeed very excited about opening our event for this year. Before we begin, we know that some of you are joining us for the very first time in a GENSA event, and therefore I would like to invite my colleague Shweta to give us a quick glimpse of who we are.
Thanks, Neha. Welcome everyone. Gender and Equity Network South Asia, or GENSA as we call it, is a network of evaluators based in South Asia that seeks to focus on evaluations with a gender and equity focus using the unique experience of the South Asian context and are relevant to our region. We held several events in 2020, want to make this a go-to network through hosting informative and cutting-edge events like this one, our very first masterclass. Going forward, we plan to organize more such events. In case you are interested in any topic or issue or would like to present, do write to us at gensanetwork@gmail.com. Thank you and have a great session. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you, Shweta. I would now like to request all members to please mute your audio and video and post your comments or queries in the chat box, and we will definitely come back to them at the end of the session. It gives me great pride to open this event with a very special video message sent by none other than Michael Quinn Patton. He's a global evaluation thinker and founder of Principles-Focused Evaluation, Developmental Evaluation, and Utilize-Focused Evaluation, and Blue Marble Evaluation. Michael has been very kind to share a few words of encouragement for our network and this event. Can we please have the video?
Just a minute, it's coming up.
Evaluation. I thank Sonal Zavari for inviting me to make this introduction, and I'm delighted that you're going to be engaging with principles-focused evaluation. It's an especially important approach for dealing with complexity, with turbulence, with rapid changes in the world. It is for programs that are principles-based, principles-driven, leaders who are principles-oriented and principles-driven, who deal with complex dynamic systems and systems transformation through principles. It involves evaluating the meaningfulness of principles, the extent to which they're adhered to, and what the results are of following those principles. I'm applying principles-focused evaluation to the revision of utilization-focused evaluation. I'm about to finish the 5th edition of that book, and the major revisions have to do with taking a principles-focused approach, identifying and talking about principles of utilization-focused evaluation, and in that work featuring the principles that I know are important to you of equity and sustainability. And I'm especially pleased and excited to be doing this revision with my daughter, Charmaine Campbell Patton, who 5 years ago decided she wanted to become an evaluator. She's one of a handful of second-generation evaluators, and she's come into the profession to work with me on Blue Marble evaluation, which is a principles-focused approach to thinking globally and acting and evaluating locally and contextually, to connect the big picture of things that are going on in the world with what's happening within your own region, within your own programs, within your own countries, within your own work and interventions and initiatives. And so as a part of the decade of evaluation for action, Blue Marble evaluation, principles-focused evaluation joins with the commitments to equity and sustainability for our future. What motivates me in this is my grandchildren, Charmaine's children, Jasper, and my granddaughter, Kawa, as we look to the future, a future of a world that is based upon principles of equity and sustainability, and where evaluation is supporting those principles in a world that's going to be different, a post-normal world after the coronavirus. The great management guru Peter Drucker said the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic. And as important as traditional ways of doing evaluation have been in complex dynamic systems for a global future based on equity and sustainability, we need principles-focused evaluation. And so as you engage in this work, as you work to look at how the principles of equity and sustainability can carry us forward and bring evaluation up to date with that work, I want to wish you the best. You're in great hands with Donna Podems. Donna is my prize graduate student with her doctorate in evaluation. She's written a tremendous book on being an evaluator that is principles focused and makes evaluation accessible. Donna will do a tremendous job of introducing you and working with you on principles focused evaluation and principles of feminist evaluation and applied into that. Donna and I have just begun working on a project together, connecting networks of evaluators around the world so that we can support each other as an evaluation community. I wish you a great session together. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this opening session.
We thank Michael Patton for the introduction of principle-focused evaluation. May I now request our GENSA representative from Nepal, Sushila Chatterjee Nepali, to please introduce our presenter, Donna Podems. Sushila ji has over 25 years of experience and expertise in community development in natural resources and biodiversity conservation, conducting research and evaluation in the field of health and gender issues. Over to you, Sushila ji, to introduce Donna Podems.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you very much. It is a great honor for me to introduce Donna Podems, who is a researcher, facilitator, and monitoring and evaluation specialist with more than 23 years of experience. She holds a doctorate in interdisciplinary studies focused on program evaluation and organizational development, and has a master's degree in public administration. She is also an author of Being an Evaluator, Your Guide to Evaluation. Donna is a former national board member for the American Evaluation Association, AEA, and the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association, SAMIA. She is an associate professor at Michigan State University, a senior research associate at University of Johannesburg, and is on the editorial board of the American Journal of Evaluation. We welcome Donna Podems to the first masterclass organized by GENSA in 2021. Over to you, Donna, and you've seen Donna through a video. And welcome. Thank you so much, Neha. Over to you, Donna.
Thank you, and thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen with everyone, and I'm going to disappear from your screens for about the next half hour, and then I'll come back after the end of the presentation. So thank you, Sonal and GENSA, again for inviting me to speak and providing a platform for me to share my current thinking on feminist evaluation, and also for presenting me with the GENSA tea mug that I'm holding in front of you. That's me, actually, in that photo, a feminist evaluator, and at times an evaluator who is simply a feminist. I don't always practice feminist evaluation, but I am influenced by being a feminist. I practice and have written about democratic evaluation, utilization-focused evaluation, developmental evaluation, process evaluation, realist evaluation, systems, approaches, and others. I love nothing more than to mix and match and be inspired by different theorists and theorists such as indigenous evaluators, social justice thinkers, and LGBTQI influencers. Yet I'm also a practitioner, and I conduct around 4 to 7 evaluative processes a year. That work, and those with whom I work, keep me grounded in reality by constantly saying, yes, I get it, and then asking, but what does that really mean? What does that actually look like in practice? And I share with you that I have struggled to apply many evaluation theories that look so pretty in the books, so perfect in published peer-reviewed case studies. And yet, in practice, these approaches often leave me wanting more guidance, wanting more specifics, more practical advice, and more honesty about their flaws. These experiences, both theoretical and practical, over the past actually 25 years, but I'll go with 23 because that makes me younger, eventually resulted in writing my own practical book on evaluation, and then further inspired me to specifically make Feminist Evaluation Practical. To do so, I combined Michael's Principle-Focused Evaluation, which I will call PFE, and Feminist Evaluation. So let's first take a look at PFE, and then I will introduce my contemporary and practical approach to Feminist Evaluation, to which I, of course, welcome your feedback and thoughts. I will leave about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and the PowerPoint and the framework that I present today will be uploaded onto the GENSA's website. So what is a principles-focused approach? Michael Quinn Patton has written a 400-page book to explain the theory. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I will simply touch on some of PFE's core elements. I'm going to explain enough of the approach to demonstrate how I have combined principle-focused evaluation, PFE, with feminist evaluation. An idea that took root about 3 years ago has slowly emerged and advanced, taking its current shape after numerous peer reviews and practical application. And it's still changing. In fact, I have new additions to make to it as of today. But back to PFE. PFE evaluation examines whether principles are clear, meaningful, and actionable. And if so, whether they're actually being followed, and if so, whether they are bringing desired results. But let's take another step backwards and clarify what is a principle and the kind of principles that PFE engages with. That understanding is critical to feminist evaluation. One of the significant weaknesses of feminist evaluation is that it does not have clear, accessible, guiding principles, and that is at the core of what my framework addresses. Principles are derived from experience, expertise, values, culture, and research. They guide our daily choices and our actions. Principles inform and guide our choices by telling us how to act. But sometimes principles can be conflicting, like the early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse, he gets the cheese. There are different kinds of principles, and today I will focus on the two that I use to adapt feminist evaluation: moral principles and effectiveness principles. A moral principle tells us what is right. An effectiveness principle tells us what works. Principle-focused evaluation examines effectiveness principles, and these are the kinds of principles that we need to make feminist evaluation practical, implementable, and accessible. Sorry, I can hear someone. If you could all please make sure that you have your microphones muted. Thank you. A good principle provides guidance for making choices and decisions, as I just mentioned, is useful in setting priorities, inspires, and supports ongoing development and adaptation. Feminist evaluation in its current form, for me, lacks that guidance, which is why many of us often struggle to explain it and explicitly use it to guide our evaluative activities. There is another concept that I take from Michael's 400-page theory that was very helpful to clarifying my thinking and influenced how I changed the feminist evaluation framework that I will present today in a few moments into an applicable approach. And it's the idea of rules of engagement versus principles of engagement. A principle is not a rule. My feminist evaluation framework does not provide rules which are strict, unbending, and as we know, rules are also at times made to be broken. Principles provide guidance. Let's take a look at a rule that most of us are familiar with: a stoplight, or also called a traffic light. In South Africa, we call them robots, but whatever you call it, this means stop, right? Red means stop. Green means go. That's a rule. And don't tell the local traffic police, but it's a rule that I break sometimes because it doesn't always fit my needs. My daughter is a junior national level swimmer. She trains at 5 a.m. in the morning. This means that we leave the house on some days at 4:30 a.m. when it's dark and the roads are mostly empty. South Africa is not a safe place, especially for two women driving on an empty road in the dark at 4:30 in the morning. When I see a red light, I slow down, I carefully look, and I keep going, because to stop and sit at a red light in the dark, waiting for it to turn green, is dangerous. So I apply the principle of defensive or careful driving. I do not apply the rule. Principles can be used in the ways that you see on your screen. And at the end, I'll show you how to use the framework in these different ways as well. Principles can inform choices at forks in the road. They're grounded in values about what matters to those who develop, adapt, and attempt to follow them. They provide direction, but not detail. They must be interpreted and applied. And finally, they actually form the rudder for navigating complex dynamic systems. I want to go back for a few minutes and repeat an earlier slide because it's a core element of explaining the PFE and FE approach. An effectiveness principle is a statement that provides guidance about how to think or behave towards some desired result, either explicit or implicit, based on norms, values, beliefs, experiences, and knowledge. The statement is a hypothesis until it is evaluated within some context to determine its relative meaningfulness, truth, feasibility, and utility for those attempting to follow it. Principle evaluation essentially looks at three kinds of questions. 1, to what extent and in what ways is the principle meaningful to those to whom it is meant to provide guidance? To what extent is the principle adhered to? If adhered to what extent and in what ways does it lead toward the desired results? In order to construct principles for feminist evaluation, or for anything actually, Michael has provided a guide. He calls it the guide, but it's also an acronym. Principles need to be guiding, useful, inspiring, developmental, and valuable. So, for example, it needs to specify which direction to go and inform priorities. It is an active verb, do this, to be effective. It is distinct from its opposite. So in other words, do this and do not do that. It's clear. Useful, it points toward the desired result. It describes what it is, and the definition is clear. It supports you as the evaluator or the program manager or the donor to make a decision. It's useful because it can be interpreted based on your situation or culture. It's feasible and actionable. It can be done. Inspiring, it's values-based, it's ethically grounded, it's meaningful, it's important. Developmental, this means that it's sensitive to context and complexity, and it's enduring but not time-bound. And finally, as an evaluator, it needs to be evaluable. Can we document and judge whether or not it's been followed? Can we document and judge what results did that principle lead to? We can determine if that principle takes us where we want to go. Did it do its job? Did it work? I'm currently working on a study right now with some of my colleagues here in South Africa on behalf of the Equity Fund. And in that, we're interviewing quite a few different feminist groups around the world. One of our key findings is that there are no consistently used feminist principles that fit the guide criteria. Yet a common goal exists for all of them: to promote equity, to address structural challenges based on gender, and to create a more equitable and better world. Some of you may be familiar with this. When we tend to talk about feminist evaluation, these are the 8 tenets that we tend to look towards. I'm very grateful to the work that was done by Sharon Brasilara and her colleagues and those that came before her in order to actually get feminist evaluation to this point. And these were published in 2014. And for an academic discussion, I find them very useful. I did reorder them for those that are familiar with the list. It informs how I think. When I look at this, I think, yes, I understand that, but it doesn't tell me what to do or how to know if I did it. I often have clients or students, or even myself, to be honest, saying or thinking, yes, I get it, I agree with it, but how do I turn that into an evaluation approach? How does it guide my evaluation? How do I make an evaluative framework from that? It can guide my thinking to a certain extent, but I find that as a practitioner, these are inaccessible. Before I talk about how to make these practical, there are 3 areas I want to talk about for which feminist evaluation often takes its hardest criticism. In making these tenets practical, I deal with some of those core challenges around how feminist evaluation looks at advocacy. It's one of the few approaches that promotes advocating with our results. Democratic evaluation would be another. Core challenges are around how it engages with politics and power. And there are core challenges with knowledge creation. Let's look at number 8. Most researchers, and in most research paradigms, do not accept that intuition can be used to make a decision around a program, around its outcomes, its success, or its effectiveness. This comes back to a discussion around what is knowledge. I mean, what is a fact? Who considers what to be a fact? Feminist evaluators accept intuition as an acceptable way of knowing, but most people in the research and evaluation world do not. Mainstream researchers and evaluators would say, if you cannot use one of your 5 senses, it is not a fact. But let's consider how we make some of life's most critical decisions, like who we fall in love with. But if we are able to make feminist evaluation credible, practical, and useful, I contend that we need to shift feminist evaluation away from a way of thinking about how to do evaluation to a way of doing that is not rules-based. So feminist evaluation becomes more rigorous and accessible by providing concrete guidance on how to implement it. So I combined feminist evaluation, what I just presented in the previous slide, with one of the newer forms of evaluation and evaluative thinking, Michael's PFE. As I mentioned earlier, PFE is based on complexity theory and systems thinking, which is compatible to feminist evaluation. To evaluate the principles, Patton suggests that the principles need to be meaningful to those who follow them, clearly articulated, provide guidance, be inspirational, and values-based. So in other words, do they fit his guide, which we reviewed in a few slides prior? To repeat, do the principles provide G, guidance? Are they useful, U, inspiring, I, developmental and adaptable to different contexts, D, and evaluable, E. One of the tenets that we looked at previously, right, was evaluation is a political activity. Most evaluators would agree with that. Evaluators' personal experiences, perspectives, and characteristics come from and lead to a particular political stance. But how do we work with that as a principle to do an evaluation? Now, if we shift it into something that's actionable like this, acknowledge and take into account that evaluation is a political activity, we can now use this and assess whether or not we actually accomplish that. I'm going to give you an example. I consider and acknowledge different voices in power during the evaluative process. For example, who has evaluated an intervention to see if people are empowered? Tell me honestly, who defined that word empowered? You, the donor, the implementation staff, the dictionary? If evaluator is allowed, and the emphasis is on allowed, the very people who are supposed to be empowered to define that word, would different criteria be developed to measure the intervention or policy? Would it be valued differently? Would different data be gathered? I mean, whose values count more? Because someone's always do. Feminist evaluation, through that principle, encourages me to ask those difficult questions. It guides me in the discussions, and it provides the theoretical backing needed to often defend such an approach. Here's another tenet that we looked at. Research methods, institutions, and practices are social constructs. Right? That's a core belief of a feminist evaluator. By changing that into an active sentence, be cognizant that research methods, institutions, and practices are social construct. It allows us to actually do it and allow me to provide an example. This example is a concrete, straightforward one about research methods, conducting interviews. What I do follows a feminist evaluation principle that I just mentioned, and it doesn't add cost to an evaluation or even much time. It does challenge some approaches out there that aim to keep the evaluator as objective. I'm actually doing air quotes, but you can't see me. Objective and removed. When conducting an interview, I am there to benefit from the information that someone has and is freely giving to me while I am being paid. I need to understand what they are telling me from their perspective, recognize their time constraints, acknowledge their feelings, accept what they tell me and how they tell me to consider it valid data. I also need to think about what is appropriate for the people with whom I interview in that context. In general, feminist evaluation encourages me to do one or all of the following things when I conduct an interview. First, I discuss consent with the person through a conversation, not a tick box exercise. I do this even when informed consent is not officially required. Simply because the ethics boards or the university or the donor does not require an informed consent to do an interview does not mean that ethically they are not required. Who makes these rules anyway? People need to know why you are there, how it can harm them or help them, or even harm those around them, how their information will or may not be used, and that they have the right to refuse the interview entirely or specific questions. They have the right to get to the end of an interview and say, actually, you cannot use any of that, because after all, it's their knowledge that you have just taken. Before I launch into a tirade of questions, I ask the person before we start the interview if they have any questions for me. Imagine some stranger asking you 35 semi-structured questions while the whole time you are thinking, wait, hold on. What is this about again? And who are you? I ask you all on this webinar, how often do you meet someone and they tell you their name and organization, and a few minutes later, how many of you remember? 3, I ask if the person has any other time constraints or any other constraints. I tell them how long the interview could last, and I ask them if that's okay. And I sincerely want to know. In other words, I spend time prior to starting the interview having a conversation. Feminist evaluation makes me a better evaluator because it supports me to engage with participants, with beneficiaries, with human beings, and uphold my value of treating others the way that I want to be treated, and it provides the principle to do so. I'm not going to go through all of the different feminist tenets, but I am going to present one more. Knowledge is culturally, socially, and temporally contingent. That's the initial feminist thinking. We need to contextualize. So what do we do with that? We need to contextualize evaluation because we recognize that knowledge is culturally, socially, and temporally contingent. And here is a final practical example of shifting a traditional M&E tool that looks good. It asks the right questions, but it's too perfect. It's textbook perfect. I mean, it's really well done. But it's essentially a Western way of collecting information. This is a form that is asked for by a feminist organization that I've worked with here in Africa, and using the most significant change. Initially, when you look at that, it looks fine. But honestly, look at the second question. What outcome and impact areas are being addressed? How many organizations could answer that off the top of their head? Or, for example, describe the story, 3 lines up, describe the story in 300 words or less. Well, what if we need 500 words to tell our story? By taking a form like this, you're not looking at the whole form here because there is not room, but this gives you an idea of providing a form to people that they are comfortable using in order to tell their story in their words. This form obtains or gets the same information as the red form that I just shared with you. It allows people a thinking process. Over the past 6 months, and they can fill in with their for whom and so on. So as they go through the form, it allows them to think and to tell their story instead of getting them to focus on, oh my gosh, what's the impact? Oh my gosh, I have 400 words. That's not the focus as a feminist of what we want to do. So that's an example of a tool where I've used the feminist framework. In the time left, I'm going to quickly take you through the actual feminist framework. I'm going to stop speaking for a few seconds just so you can take a look, and then I'll take you through the beginning part. This feminist framework will be available from GENSA. As I mentioned, it's still in draft form, and there's actually some changes I thought about today that I still need to make to it. But let me take you through it here. In the yellow section, questions to consider when contemplating feminist evaluation as an approach. So when you're thinking about using feminist evaluation, here are 6 questions that you should be reflecting around. Number 1, does the evaluation context warrant a potentially benefit from at least one FE core belief? I mentioned that one specifically because to do a feminist approach or a feminist evaluation, you will most likely mix it with another approach, and it is not mandatory. There is no rule that you must use all 8 principles. Number 4, how would decisions around data collection benefit from a way of thinking? And I gave some examples just in the slide prior. Or 6, How would feminist evaluation influence communication findings to enhance use? So this is a way of taking the principles and walking yourself through the questions that you need to ask before the evaluation starts. Due to the size of the slides, I've had to break this up into sections. So I will take you onto the lower part of the framework, where what I've done is I've collected, and you only see a part here, I've collected 10 common questions that I'm often asked when I conduct feminist evaluation. And these are the ones that I find after 15 years, I'm asked repetitively. For example, we would like the evaluator to use a feminist approach, and then what do? Or we want to use a feminist approach, but we need to use quantitative data for the evaluation for it to have any credibility. Or we want to use a gender approach, but not feminist evaluation. So these kinds of questions are in the framework, where it gives you a general idea of what you might run into as a common question, and then it gives some ideas of the kind of response that might be helpful. This is a very beginning understanding of the kinds of competencies that are needed to practice feminist evaluation. I'm not entirely convinced of these yet myself, and I think there's some column answers I'd like to still switch, and there are some I'd like to add. But what I do feel strongly about on the required side is that you need to understand feminist evaluation and how to apply it. And on the right, it is an option whether or not you are or claim to be a feminist. You do need to agree with or understand or value a feminist evaluation approach. But you do not need to label yourself or consider yourself to be a feminist. Knowledge of evaluation approaches, but let me jump to the next one, research skills and developing a research design. Feminist evaluation is not a sloppy, easy approach. In fact, when I conduct feminist evaluation, I have more questions, and may I even say more attacks on my evaluation with regards to its data credibility than I do when I conduct a realist or UFE or a democratic evaluation approach. I almost feel that my feminist evaluation, in my experience, carries a much higher level of qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method design and implementation. I draw your attention to the last one. I think it is required to have a thick skin. Doing feminist evaluation can be difficult. It can be challenging. Unfortunately, feminist evaluation in its name automatically sometimes, most times, gets people a little uneasy. We don't have a lovely name like, who would argue with empowerment evaluation? Everyone agrees with empowerment. Or utilization-focused evaluation. We all want use. Or realist. Everyone wants to be a realist, or at least most people who are evaluators. But we come burdened with the name of feminist evaluation, and we need to engage with that. When you have this framework in front of you, there are 4 different ways to use it. And these are the 4 ones that Patton brings, and I mentioned at the start of the presentation. You can use the principles as a unit of analysis. In other words, that's the focus of the evaluation, not the outcomes, the principles. 2, you can use the approach as a way to develop programming or to design programs, to design interventions, to design policies. You can use the framework as a way to simply navigate a complex dynamic system. And of course, you can use it as an approach to evaluation. As I mentioned, there are at least 3 common reasons that feminist evaluation is not often considered in an evaluation design, or it's not considered to be credible. The name feminist evaluation offends or perhaps alienates, which leads to people not often reading what the theory actually is or wrongly assuming what it is, which is compounded by its, well, our own poor labeling and defining of the approach. The third reason, however, is what I focused on today. The third reason has to do with why I merged principle-focused evaluation with feminist evaluation. Feminist evaluation is difficult to implement due to the lack of concrete guidance, which of course then influences, often negatively, its rigor and its credibility. I'm going to start wrapping up, and what I'd like to say is that I do not hide under the pretext of a gender approach. Pure gender approaches are easy and at times very appropriate and useful. Yet recognize that these approaches challenge nothing and no one. The PFE-FE framework that I've shared with you today unlocks thinking and provides guidance about how to apply feminist principles to data collection, analysis, and interpretation, to explore the many differences that influence how people receive and value an intervention, including policies. It enables a credible approach that is less easily attacked. It still will be attacked. Or may I say, I can now better defend against mainstream evaluation and patriarchal institution criticism of a feminist approach. That brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'm going to pass over to the GENSA team to oversee the question and answer session. And I would just like to mention that I do teach a feminist evaluation course online, which goes a lot more in depth and a lot more broad than what I've shared with you today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. It's been a thrill for me. And now I pass the floor back to GENSA.
Thank you so much, Donna, for that very interesting session. And I'm sure we would like to get back. We would now like to take some comments and questions. May I now request my colleague Bijita to take us through the questions, please? Bijita, please unmute.
Hello. Am I audible? So sorry about that. Thanks so much, Donna, and thanks, Neha. So we do have some very interesting questions, actually. The first one is from, okay, so we have another one now. So a couple of them from Catherine Bogman. The first one, she says, in my experience, there are definitely values, principles that are shared in common with feminist organizations. For example, horizontality, transparency, decolonization of knowledge, solidarity, centralization of analysis of power. So are you saying that these aren't, based on your research, made explicit enough in terms of how they are lived, quote unquote, or operationalized?
Yes, so what I am saying is, yes, exactly, is that we can look at those values. There's lots of values and principles shared by feminist organizations that overlap with human rights, democratic, and other kinds of theories and civil rights groups. The challenge, though, is how do we shift them into the guide framework? How do we make them actionable and accessible? Because they're there. So I feel like our field is almost there. We just need to take that one more step, which I think PFE helps us do. So thank you for that question. It's a great point. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Donna. And there's a small, there's another question, which I'll summarize for you, again, from Catherine. What part of PFE was appreciated or did better because of PFE? Is it not time consuming? Do evaluators get so much time? She's asking.
I'm sorry, time consuming to apply to apply the PFE-FE framework?
Right.
Or time-consuming to assess principles?
So basically, she's saying that in reality, often feminist women's rights organizations and donors have minimal time or bandwidth for an elaborate process of developing principles, which might feel like more of an academic exercise. We get a lot of pushback as evaluators from this. So in that sense, she's curious to know what aspects of PFE have been most useful, accessible for your clients.
Okay, first of all, I agree. I also share that same experience. And I mean, in a way, it's ironic, right? Because it's almost like we're trying to do feminist evaluation within a very patriarchal system that doesn't allow us to do it, right? So I share that experience. What I think the framework allows us to do is that it allows us to be credible and explicit about what feminist evaluation is, about what we're doing. So we can say we share all these values and so on, but here's what we're going to evaluate and here's how we're going to do it. I don't think it takes any more time than another kind of participatory collaborative evaluation. I do think it makes it more explicit about what exactly we consider to be feminist. And when we're done, we can assess ourselves against what we did, which I think is a huge step, a huge leap, I think, for feminist evaluation. But the framework is still in its infancy.
Right. Thanks, Donna. The next question is from Barbara Klugman. She's asking, what do you see as the added value of naming an approach feminist as compared with equity focused, which would presumably have similar values and approaches? So by calling it feminist,
I mean, look, this varies by organization. If an organization is feminist, it may be important to them that it carries that label. It's their value. For me, I'm not so hung up on the labels. I'm more concerned around what are we going to do, why are we doing it, and how is it going to help those that we work with or our peers or so on. I do not think that it needs to be labeled. However, I do think we need to be clear about what we are doing. This framework is a feminist framework, and it is not the same as a human rights approach. It is not the same as an equity approach. It is different because it brings in, at times, a nuanced difference, but yet a difference. I just want to point out that that is also one of the questions we get hit hard on with feminist evaluation that I think is a little bit unfair. Because if you actually look at democratic evaluation, utilization-focused evaluation, empowerment evaluation, if you look at some of the more mainstream approaches, 80 to 90% of them are saying the same thing. So thank you.
Thanks, Donna. The next question is from Caitlin Blazer. She's asking, in practice, I have often found it difficult in an evaluation to explain the difference between a feminist evaluation approach and a program with feminist objectives. Do you have suggestions for ways to make this clear to non-evaluators?
I'm sorry, I'm going to clarify that question. The difference between objectives and evaluation?
No, she's asking the difference between a feminist evaluation approach and a program with feminist objectives. So an evaluation approach and maybe a project or a program that has feminist objectives. Now, do you have suggestions for ways to?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because I also took a while for me to think about that myself in doing this framework. I think if an organization has feminist objectives, okay, you can very easily bring in any evaluation approach to see whether or not they were achieved, right? A human rights approach, an effectiveness approach, most significant change, you name it. It doesn't need necessarily to be a feminist approach to determine whether or not you've reached your feminist objectives. I could use a feminist evaluation approach on a non-feminist organization. Yeah,
right.
That's a great question.
All right, so I think we have quite a few questions, but do we have time for more? So I think we're going to stop at that because we just have time for so many. But we would respond to all the other questions shortly via email. Donna, we'll share the questions with Donna, the rest of them that you haven't been able to answer, and maybe you can respond to them and we can then share the responses. So please feel free to write to us at gensanetwork.com. And on that note, let's take a moment for a closing poll. Can we have the poll question up? So your thoughts about the masterclass?
It's very strange to watch myself being evaluated. Don't let that influence the answers.
All right. So, oh, wow. So most definitely people want more sessions on this. They want to know more. And they say they have learned something new, which is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Donna. And a big thank you, everyone, for your valuable time. We hope you have enjoyed the session. In case you have not joined our network already, we request you to please join through the link provided in the chat box. We are already a 160 plus strong organization, a network, and we want to expand our membership. We are also looking for volunteers from the South Asian countries to be a part of our task forces, and request you to please write to us in case you're interested in joining. We are currently building and updating our website, and we'll be announcing the details soon. So thank you once again from all of us here at GENSA. Stay well, stay safe, and stay hopeful in the new year. Thank you.